I work at the Sole 24 Ore. So first thing I did this morning is buying the paper I work for, Il Sole 24 Ore. And there's a very timely title on the labor market. One has to do with the US freezing down of job creation in the US. And this is very much a snapshot of the situation with unemployment rising at 8%. And this is a figure that is considered to be extremely alarming. And then there's the reaction of US President Barack Obama saying that this figure, which is synonymous with a sharp reduction in the number of jobs and with the halt of the recovery, is due to the Eurozone. And then there is another information which is evidence here on the paper concerning Europe, and it is just as alarming as the other piece of news. In April, the unemployment rate in the Eurozone climbed to 11%. The EU 27 is marked by a 10.23%, and according to Eurostat, there are 24,600,000 unemployed. These are the facts. Hence, the subject of today's lecture is of the utmost importance. We shall hear from Professor HALTIWANGER, who is the most distinguished expert on all issues concerning the labor market, about potential solutions in the US and Italy to revert this trend that is harming geopolitical equilibrium worldwide. As you know, we had a remarkable crisis in Europe of sovereign debt. In Italy, as is true for the rest of Europe, there's a problem, i.e. how to revert the trend, how to lay down the basis for a greater stability to try and create more jobs. Unfortunately, in Italy, we are not going to do very well because we are in the midst of a recession. 1.2% is the reduction of our GDP, according to our government data, and this is going to possibly climb up to 1.7. And in Europe, the unemployment rate is very high, and the growth is absolutely stagnating. What are the potential solutions to create more jobs? So this is the key issue. One of the questions that I'd like to raise to Professor HALTIWANGER is whether we can see a solution for the middle time with economies recovering but not creating new jobs. This is one possibility. Do you think that we can grow without creating new jobs? Is this a possibility? Then second question, but I'm sure that Professor HALTIWANGER is going to reply to these questions with this lecture. What are the models that can potentially increase and promote job creation? In Italy, for example, we had the excellence of the SMEs. In Italy, most of the productive fabric of the country is very much based on SMEs. Is it still a model that is worth exporting, that is still viable in itself? Then, third question, are there new companies creating new jobs? What about old and established companies? Are they going to destroy jobs? These are very relevant issues, and this is what is at stake, I believe. This is the possibilities we have to have a future at all in Europe. Now, having said this much, recording again most alarming data as we see in the papers today, I'd like to give the floor straight away to Professor HALTIWANGER for him to present his lecture. After that, I think we can have a Q&A time. I, for myself, have a number of questions that I'd like to raise to Professor HALTIWANGER, and then obviously we'll throw the floor open. The subject is extremely important, and I expect you to raise many questions. So over to you, Professor HALTIWANGER.
Well, thanks for having me. It's very nice to be here. They turned on the mic so I can hear me, or at least the translator can. So at this conference, I know age is a key theme, and a lot of the work is on age of workers, particularly, I'll say, concerns about young workers. Unemployment for young workers, I'll say, especially in European countries, is incredibly high. So I'm also going to talk about age, but I'm actually going to talk more about age of businesses than age of workers. That's going to be my theme. So hopefully I can. So as the opening remarks, and I think I know, having talked to a number of folks who've already chatted at this conference, a key theme is obviously both the U.S. and especially Europe are still very much struggling, and they're struggling in their labor markets in terms of employment growth and unemployment. And so it's not surprising, as again the opening remark suggested, that there's an enormous amount of interest in who creates jobs. What's the job creation process like? And I'm going to talk quite a bit about that. So one of the key themes I'm going to talk about is the role of small businesses in job creation. In the United States, at least, and again, given the introduction, I think this must be some perception here in Europe. The conventional wisdom, I'd say, at least until the work that I'm going to talk about today, is that small businesses were the primary net creators of jobs. If you do a Google search on U.S. presidential State of the Union addresses, and you go back to at least Ronald Reagan, every president, so this is not a Democrat or Republican point of view, all of them have made the statement that small businesses are the primary net creators of jobs. The typical statistic is that 2/3 of net job creation comes from small businesses. And so I want to talk about that wisdom. Is that right? I'm going to argue, while it's technically true, it's somewhat misleading. Indeed, what I'm going to talk about is it's not the size of the business that matters, it's the age of the business that matters, that it will turn out to be the case. The evidence I'll show is the contribution of small businesses to job creation is coming from the role of business startups and fast-growing young businesses, and that's vital. And some might say, well, isn't this just a reinterpretation of the existing evidence? And I think there's some truth to that. But I think it actually makes you think about the process of job creation in a different way than if you just use the notion of small rather than young. So you're going to see on my last slide, I'm basically going to be arguing it's better to be young than petite. That's sort of the theme of the talk. Now, to get there, I want to put the role of startups and young businesses into perspective. So I'm going to talk about jobs from a whole bunch of different dimensions to help us understand the job creation process. Most of in fact, all of my evidence is going to be from the United States, although I have, can I say, studied European economies and emerging economies on these issues. And so I will at least occasionally make reference to what I think we see in European and emerging economies as well. So in order to do this, I'm actually going to use some kind of playful allusions here in terms of talking about businesses. So oftentimes you'll see in my slides, I'll talk about large businesses, they'll be my elephants, okay? And I'll talk about small businesses, and they'll be my mice, all right? And one thing that's true, and I know actually this fact is very much true in the U.S., but I know is also true here in Italy and in Europe, is most businesses are small. So I'm going to give you those statistics in terms of the United States, but this is something we see around the world. So in the United States, to fix ideas, there's roughly 6 million businesses that have at least one worker. And I'm going to be talking about those. Since I'm about job creation, I don't want to talk about the self-employed. They're an important group who don't hire workers. I think that's a different kind of topic. It's related, but it's not the same. I'm going to talk about, when I mean a business, I mean you've hired at least one worker. And so of the 6 million or so businesses, the vast majority of them are these mice, these micro businesses. They have less than 10 workers. And only a very small fraction are elephants. And out of that 6 million, you can see there's less than 20,000 businesses that have more than 500 workers. So when thinking about the business population, it's useful just to know most businesses are small. Now, while that's true, what's especially true in the United States, and this does vary across the world, is that while most businesses are small, most workers work for large businesses. So this is especially true in the United States, is that we have a very skewed size distribution of activity. And I'm not saying that's not true in Europe, and actually often it is to the most extent true in advanced economies. Where you see that this breakdown are very different is if you go around and look at the emerging economy. So if I showed you this chart, for example, for India, you'd be struck by the incredibly large share of employment accounted for by micro businesses, and even smaller than my mice, because oftentimes they are actually the informal firms that account for a large fraction of activity. So something's going on in terms of the distribution. Most firms are small, and most workers work for large businesses. And so this is in the cross-section, but it's helping us kind of understand the nature of the distribution of jobs in firms. Now, what's limiting about just looking at the cross-section is, and I think we're all painfully aware of that these days, and given the news, obviously over the last 5 years, but even recently, the world is obviously constantly changing. Businesses are subject to a whole variety of changing business conditions, everything from the kind of financial crisis that we've looked at, but changing technology, changing patterns of trade, changing patterns of demand. And so what's interesting and a challenge, and this is going to be very much the theme of my remarks, of modern advanced economies, is they're constantly needing to reinvent themselves. And so I want to talk about what evidence we have about that constant reinventing itself. And this is critical for helping us understand the process of job creation. So this slide, where I've got some businesses going up and some businesses going down, is just to help us begin thinking about that process. What we see in, can I say, in all advanced economies, is we see this process, whether it's a good year or a bad year, we see some businesses expanding and some businesses contracting. And I want to talk quite a bit about the evidence for that, what I'm going to call creation and destruction processes. And I'm going to use those terms because I'm going to think about this in terms of jobs. So when you think about that, again, I want you to think about the terms I'm going to use. I'm going to use the term job creation for counting up all the jobs for businesses that expand, including those that start up. And I'm going to use the term job destruction for all the businesses that contract, and including those that shut down. And it's this process which is critical for all the hires and separations that we see in the economy. A small aside, and I think it's actually more than an aside, but it's not the theme of this lecture. There's actually even a much higher pace of hires and separations than job creation and destruction. That is, we see lots of businesses expanding have separations. They have quits, and they need to replace workers. And actually, interestingly, we actually see businesses that are contracting oftentimes having more separations than they need, and so they're actually also doing some hiring. And that's interesting all by itself, just that churning of workers on top of the churning of jobs. It's not my theme today, but it's important to recognize that's going on. That's part of also the way the economies reinvent themselves. We reinvent ourselves, I'd say, in at least two kind of basic ways. We move jobs across businesses. That's what I'm mostly going to be about. And then, even for existing businesses, we move workers across those businesses. And I'm not going to be so much about that, but it's important. You're going to see in the next slide an enormous pace of creation and destruction. But actually, hires and separations are even larger than that. So what is the pace of creation and destruction? And again, I'll use the U.S. evidence. This is evidence that covers the entire U.S. private sector. And actually, it's a database that covers every establishment and every firm in the United States for a long period of time. And so let me describe the two key statistics and then some of the underlying statistics. So one key statistic is the pace of gross job creation. Okay, and again, I've already described that conceptually, but let me repeat it. I'm going to add up all the jobs from businesses that expanded from one March to the next. This is a March to March number. And that number is enormous in the United States on an annual basis. It's close to 17%. So let's make sure everybody understands how big that number is and how to interpret it. What that number says is if you go into the U.S. economy in a typical year over the last 30 years, and you go on in the week, including March 12th, that happens to be the date in which we measure things, and you ask how many of the jobs that existed at businesses didn't even exist the year before. And by that I mean they didn't exist in the sense the business didn't even exist, the establishment wasn't there, or the firm wasn't there, or the business was smaller a year ago. And that's 17% of U.S. jobs. All right? Now, if we had no job destruction, that would mean the U.S. would be growing, obviously, at a 17% net growth rate. Obviously, that's not what's going on. We pay attention mostly to the net number. So why isn't the U.S., even though it's got all these businesses expanding and starting up, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second, it's also got an enormous pace of job destruction. So if I go conduct exactly that same experiment, and I go and ask, on a given March, I ask, what fraction of jobs that are here this March aren't even going to exist next year, are gone, because the business has shrunk. They've either shut down, the establishment has shut down, or the firm has shut down. And I'll explain that distinction in just a second. Or the business has contracted. And you can see that's over 15%. So the net number, which is what we're very much interested in seeing being positive, obviously, and that's not been so true for both Europe lately, and has been kind of anemic, if you read the jobs report from the United States yesterday. So we care about the net number, but underlying that number is an enormous pace of creation and destruction. So one thing you can also see in this slide is that new firms and new establishments, as well as exiting establishments and exiting firms, play a critical role. So I needed to make sure you understand the distinction between establishments and firms. And so I'll use large retail chains. That's sort of the easiest example. And I'll use one that's sort of very well understood around the world. I'll use Walmart. Okay, so when I use the term firm, I mean the entire firm Walmart. When I use the term establishment, I mean like a Walmart store, an individual location. So you can see, for example, there's a healthy amount of job creation from existing firms that open up new locations. That's what I mean by saying new establishments of existing firms. All right? But there's also, the bottom bar is new firms. And what do I mean by that? I mean literally new firms. I mean firms that did not exist before. And I don't just mean they're new because there's been some merger change or some ownership change. I mean there's a new firm with all new establishments. So it's what we mean as a startup. This business did not exist in any way in the previous year. And you can see that's about, it's not the whole story, obviously, but that's about, in gross sense, and that's important to think about it, in a gross sense, that's about 1/5 of gross job creation. Hardly the whole story. Lots of job creation and destruction from existing firms, and also lots from exiting and entering establishments of existing firms. But I am going to focus a lot on the role of these startups. You can also see a healthy amount of job destruction is coming from exiting firms too. So entry and exit is playing an important role. So I'm going to dig into these numbers in a number of different ways. Now, before I dig into these, I want to go back to the conventional wisdom. So President Barack Obama, President George Bush, both 1 and 2, President Clinton, President Reagan, they've all made this statement, and also, I'll say, many other policymakers. I don't mean to just pick on the presidents, but they are some of the most prominent spokesmen for what's going on in the United States, have all said small businesses are the primary net creators of jobs. Is that true? Well, in a technical way, the answer is yes. Although there are some statistical issues that I don't want to go into details about, what's known as regression to the mean. But even if I control for that, technically the conventional wisdom is true. So where's that conventional wisdom coming from? What you do is you compute the net employment growth rate, I'll say on an appropriate employment weighted basis, because you don't want to you want to weight up so these numbers add up to the overall economy. You compute the net employment growth rate for every type of firm in terms of firm size classes, and you classify firms in this graph in terms of their size last year. All right, and the only exception to that is for startups, since they didn't exist as last year, you put them in the size class that they entered. That's how this is done. This is a standard thing that's done by many statistical agencies around the world, including the United States. And it's pretty striking, actually, that the net employment growth is obviously much higher for the small business. And indeed, it's especially high for the mice that I was talking about. Okay, so it looks like there's something going on here. And indeed, if you do the calculation, where did that 2/3 number come from that the presidents often use? Well, if you add up, they use kind of a liberal definition of small. They go all the way up to 500. I'm sure that in Italy, 500 doesn't seem like a small business. But they go all the way up to 500. And if you count up all the jobs created by the green bars here under 500, you'll get 2/3. All right? So we could stop the lecture here and say, okay, the presidents of the United States have been right, and let's go on. And so let's think about what the policy implications. And indeed, I'd sort of say, somewhat unfortunately, that's kind of what's happened often in the United States. There has been substantial policy, both by Republicans and Democrats in the United States, that have essentially used this evidence to advocate particular kinds of policies in favor of small businesses. So I want to dig into this. What's going on here? Now, to get there, now I want to dig into just helping us understand the role of the magnitude of business startups. And so remember, business startups accounted for about 1/5 of gross job creation. Okay, but that was all the jobs being created. So now let's compare the magnitude of the job creation from startups to net job creation. And I've intentionally, to make this point, I've actually taken, this point would be even more dramatic if I didn't take periods of rapid expansion. I took the last period of a rapid expansion in the United States. So the last period of a rapid expansion was March 2003 to 2007. And in a typical year, over that year, the U.S. would create 2.5 million net new jobs. And for those of you who are, aficionados of U.S. statistics, so yesterday, the jobs report, there was a net creation of 69,000 jobs. That's a very small number. 2.5 million, roughly, this is not quite the right thing to do, but roughly divide 2.5 million by 12. And so any month in which the U.S. gets over 200,000 jobs, things are going okay. 69,000? That's pretty anemic, all right? And so obviously this has made headlines around the world this morning. So net job creation in a robust economy was in the neighborhood of 2.5 million net new jobs. Notice that startups alone accounted for 3 million net jobs by themselves, all right? So you know, just as I said before, you got to be careful about statistics. You need to be careful to interpret this. Some people have taken this graph. I've generated this graph. So some people have taken this graph and run with it. They run with it in the following way. They said, look, startups are responsible for all net job creation. Is that right? No, I've actually already given you the evidence that suggests otherwise. There's lots of other kind of businesses creating jobs. Startups are part of this creative destruction process. But nevertheless, this graph does tell you the magnitude of startup creation is quite large relative to net job creation. So it's an important component. It's something we need to pay attention to. And so I'm going to dig into that process. Now, it turns out most startups start up as mice. And I think that's an important thing to think about. Most new businesses start up as very small businesses. Right? So of that 3 million jobs coming in every year from startups, that's a lot of jobs. They're coming from micro businesses. Right? Now, to be fair, there's some that start up, you know, a little bit higher than obviously the mice, but nevertheless they tend to be small. And so now you can almost see where the challenge to the conventional wisdom is coming from. All of the startups get allocated to the small businesses. So what we were actually seeing in the previous graph about small businesses was really the role of startups, and we're also going to see the role of fast-growing young businesses. So what do I mean by that? So this graph shows you the original graph I showed you before for the conventional wisdom. And then what it does is it controls for business age and says, suppose what I do is I take out the effect of business age in this relationship. Then that's the blue bars, and you see there's no longer any systematic relation between net growth and size. It's gone. So whatever was the relationship between net growth and size, it was driven by the role of age. It was not, there is nothing left once I control for age. Now, we've already understood part of that process. So part of what's simply going on is that startups are small. By construction, they only create jobs in their first year. That's the nature of the process. And so if I do a simple tabulation of net growth by size, I'm going to make it look like the small businesses are doing all the work. And then technically that's right, but it's actually coming from this startup process. Now, I'm not going to, there's lots of analysis underlying this, and I am going to dig more into this a bit, but one remark to make is, and if you're interested, contact me and I can provide you the more detailed evidence. One interesting thing to look at is how well do small mature businesses do? And actually, small mature businesses in the U.S., they're net job destroyers, not net job creators. Okay, so the job creation prowess of small businesses again is coming very much from the role of startups, and it will turn out young businesses. Now, again, I want to dig into this process a little bit. Let's think about what happens after you start up. What happens to the typical startup? Well, if I pay attention to the blue bars, and you can see I've introduced another animal here. So I've got mice, and I've got elephants, and then I've got gazelles. And this is overly simplistic, I know, but I want you to think about the gazelles. That's essentially how some mice become elephants. All right, there are businesses that take off. And if you look at the blue bars in this graph, these are the surviving businesses by business age. And so if you want to ask who are the fastest growing businesses in the United States, conditional on survival, it's clearly the young businesses. All right? There's a clear monotonic relationship, and especially the very young. But this graph also shows what's the typical outcome for a startup. It actually fails. All right? So the terminology I want to use is there's a very rich up and out dynamic, up or out dynamic of young businesses. Some of them take off, and we're going to see that in detail in just a minute. Some of them take off. Those are my gazelles for today's lecture. But most of them fail. And this is already beginning to help us think about the challenges that you face in a modern economy. If indeed what's going on, we're constantly reinventing ourselves with startups coming in, and you could say they're pushing the frontier out in terms of new products and new processes, new ways of doing business. If that's what's going on in a successful economy, it's kind of a chaotic, turbulent environment. It's an environment where there's lots of entry, there's lots of growth, but there's also lots of contraction and failure. All right? And that's a challenge, right? Because failure is a hard thing to take into account. So again, I want to dig into that process a little bit more. So let's look at these high growth young businesses. Let's look a little bit more deeply at these businesses. And so again, what was striking in the previous figure was that young businesses were the fastest growing businesses in the United States. Now, is it the case that all young businesses that survive are fast growing? No, actually. There's the most heterogeneity amongst the young businesses of any kind of businesses in the United States. So what this graph shows is the 90th percentile growth rate and the 10th percentile growth rate. And a measurement point, this is all employment weighted, so this is not being driven all by just tiny businesses, because if a business has one worker and goes to 2, that's obviously a very rapid growth rate. So I've employment weighted all this. It's quite striking just how heterogeneous, you could say all businesses are, but especially young businesses. But actually I want to point out a different aspect of this, not just the heterogeneity. I want to point out the skewness of the growth rate. So I want you to pay attention to how large the 90th percentile is in absolute value relative to the 10th percentile. So notice, for example, that for, let's take age 1 businesses, they're at the 90th percentile, they're way above 80% growth rate, okay? Whereas the 10th percentile is about 50% shrinkage. All right, so that's enormous heterogeneity, but that's a big gap between the 90th and the 10th in terms of absolute magnitude. So remember, my first graphs were about the skewness of the levels of employment. I think an important thing also to take into account is the skewness of the growth rates. And I'm going to, in just a minute, tell you how critically important this skewness is. All right? But you can see, if nothing else, statistically, there is enormous skewness in the growth rate distribution, especially for the young businesses. So why is this important? So now I'm going to go back to this concept I started with early, which is the overall pace of gross job creation. So I'm going to now kind of provide an answer of who creates jobs. If you add up the job creation from startups, which is close to 20%, and then you add up the job creation from these fast-growing businesses, and they are disproportionately young, you're at 70% of U.S. job creation. So it's a combination of startups and fast-growing young businesses. They are the creators of jobs. All right. Now I think that those findings, and I'm going to present a very simple, almost playful way of thinking about this, help us think about what are the possible barriers to job creation, or what are the obstacles that economies face. If this is true, if startups and fast-growing young businesses play an important role, what are the challenges that such businesses face? Now, before I get there, Some of you should rightfully, if you haven't seen these kind of numbers before, if you haven't seen these kind of numbers on job creation and destruction before, you might ask, why can that make sense? Why would an economy, this is a supposedly successful economy like the United States, U.S. has had a very robust, at least pre-2006, a robust set of decades. Why does it have such a high pace of creation and destruction? Why does it have so much churning of firms and jobs? And the answer is most of this, at least when things are going well, when the economy is not distorted, and I'd say recently it looks like it's increasingly distorted, but when the economy is not distorted, the creation's moving resources towards more productive businesses, and the destruction's moving it away from less productive businesses. And so one of the things we found in the same kind of work, really the same kind of data that's helped us understand this job creation and destruction process, is we've looked at measures of productivity, for example, across businesses. And one of the most striking findings is go inside a very narrow industry. And let me make sure you understand what I mean by a narrow industry. I mean, for example, take automobile assembly plants, okay? Or take something, since we're all obviously wearing clothing, take women's blouses, okay, as an industry, okay? Some industry, some particular narrow definition of products. And take all the businesses that produce in that industry in your country. And can I say, actually, I know this holds in literally every country that we're talking about, and I'll talk a little bit about how it differs between the U.S. and around the world. So go inside any one of those industries, almost as narrow as you can imagine. Okay, by narrow classification into a particular kind of good or service. And take the business at the 75th percentile of productivity, and the measure of productivity here I'm using is as refined a measure of productivity as an economist can come up with. It's what we call total factor productivity. And there's lots of measurement issues, but we've worked very hard with some success, there's still measurement challenges, to measure this at the establishment and the firm level. So take the business at the 75th percentile of total factor productivity, and then take the business at the 25th percentile. And that gap in the United States is about 30%, 30 log points. That's a huge gap. That would just to help you understand, we make a big deal at the aggregate level if productivity goes up from 1% to 2%. If you could somehow magically, and this is the problem, of course, if I could somehow magically move all the resources away from the 25th percentile business to the 75th percentile business, I could raise productivity in the United States enormously. And so when you see that, you might say, well, why isn't that going on? Why don't we see that? And the answer is, it is going on. It just takes time and resources. That's exactly what the creative destruction process is all about, is moving resources away from the less productive to the more productive businesses. And so if you ask yourself, why is this going on? Well, what we find is, and you can say, well, why is there so much heterogeneity in productivity? Well, can I say most of us have worked, I don't know, actually maybe a lot of us in this room haven't worked for the private sector, but if you talk to folks in the private sector, even again businesses doing seemingly the same thing, they vary dramatically in their productivity. Why? Well, we're studying that. Some of it's managerial ability. It's entrepreneurial ability. Some of it is they were in the right place at the right time. They developed the process and the combination of processes that work to produce this product. Right? But by the way, it actually is related to other kinds of things. So given limited time, I'm not going to go into great detail. It's important to realize that some of this creative destruction is not moving resources so much simply for productivity reasons, but rather moving resources away from low demand products to high demand products. So demand matters here as well. Some of it's costs. So lots of the reallocation is moving resources away from, even though this business might be very productive in an engineering sense, it's not particularly profitable because it's operating in a high-cost region, for example. And so businesses are constantly relocating. This is, this is the challenge partly of globalization, is exactly what's going on, is companies are constantly seeking ways to produce things where they can create the most value. And what does that mean? I think it means you want to be the most productive, you want to have the highest demand for your product, and you want to have the lowest costs. Not always those things go together, by the way, but those are the kind of things you worry about. Oops. So is the dynamics that I'm talking about connected to this? Yes. So let's go back to that upper-out dynamic that I talked about before. So remember I said, what happens to most startups? They fail. Well, the good news is, I'll call it good news, exit's a hard thing, right? So when a business fails, that's costly. But the good news is, when things at least are going well, the businesses that are exiting are much less productive than the incumbent businesses. So that's a good thing for an economy. If indeed if you're trying to experiment and reinvent yourself, the businesses that should be contracting and shutting down are the ones creating the least value. So that's a good thing. And you can also see that my fast-growing businesses, my young businesses, they are amongst the most productive businesses in the economy. So can I say that's a win-win kind of situation in the sense that when the upper-out dynamics are working well, the startups that survive are the most productive businesses. They're the ones creating the products and the processes that are that have the most value, and they're creating lots of jobs. And so it's a win-win in the sense it's good for jobs and it's good for productivity. And again, that's when things are working well. Okay? And there's lots of reasons, as we'll see in just a minute, things can go wrong. So let me skip this slide. So now I want to talk a little bit about where things can go wrong. And the way I'm going to do this is so economists, you could say for better or worse, write down mathematical models to describe how they think firms and workers are interacting with each other. And the last thing I want to do in this setting is write down such a model. And so instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of give you almost a picture book version of some of the barriers that businesses face. And this is way too simplistic, I know, but I think it helps me at least talk about, in terms of this upper-out dynamic, this startup process, where things can go wrong. So let's talk about startups. So if you're an entrepreneur and you have, can I say, any hope of being successful, what do you need? You need an idea. Okay? You need some product or some process. And I mean that in the broadest of senses. It may mean that simply you recognize a market opportunity. There's no coffee shop at that corner. There's no good restaurant that serves this kind of food in this neighborhood. So it doesn't have to be, oftentimes I use product or process, but I mean this in the broadest of senses. Okay? So you need an idea. Right? Now, one thing that we've seen in the data, and I'm not going to bring this so much, but what we've seen, remember I told you there's enormous heterogeneity in productivity across businesses. That's especially true for new entrepreneurs. So the productivity is enormously heterogeneous across those businesses. So the next thing you need, obviously, and this is critical, and this is going to be one of the themes about what we're in. If you're going to take that step and you're going to open up this new business, somebody's going to have to finance it. All right? And so financing plays a critical role. Now, let's suppose you've got an idea and you found financing. The financing may have come from many sources. It may have come from your own sources. In the United States, historically, lots of the financing, for example, has come out of home equity. And so people use the value of their houses to put up the resources to get their business startup. Can I say one of the consequences of the collapse of the housing market is that's much less feasible than it was pre-2006, right? Am I saying that that's the whole source of the crisis? No. But I'm just telling you, making us think about what some of the barriers are. So let's suppose you've got an idea, you decide to open up, and the business is born, okay? And much of my remarks are that's obviously just the beginning of the story. The rich dynamics comes. It turns out, I should have said, I forgot this point. a key point is that most of those business startups are small. All right, and that's kind of for, you could say, for good reason. Does that suggest that things are going wrong? No, actually, partly because there's so much uncertainty about whether the idea is any good. And there's uncertainty both by both the entrepreneur, but also by financial markets. You know, so somebody wants to say, okay, yeah, this is a great idea. You're the next Google. Here, I'm going to go give you this enormous amount of financing. It shouldn't work that way. One actually has to establish that that idea is a sensible idea. But amongst these startups, obviously, some of them are my up businesses, and some of them are my out businesses. Some of them are my businesses they discover, they learn about, yeah, they're actually a good manager. They have a good idea. They have a good product. They have a good process. They have a good location. And they take off. And again, let's go back to my numbers on job creation. Adding up the contribution of business startups and the fast-growing young businesses, I get an enormous fraction of job creation from such businesses. They play a critical role, my gazelles. But I also need to recognize, and this is critical here, that I can't forget that actually most of them are failing. And so if I've got a system, if things are going badly so that the businesses that are failing and the workers who are losing their jobs with failing businesses can't find other jobs because there's market failures and distortions in labor markets or product markets or financial markets, this isn't going to work very well, right? This is only going to work if indeed we can both tolerate the successes. That's sort of what we want to all talk about, the high growth businesses. But we also need to have a system that enables us to absorb all the destruction and all the failure. Now, it's also the case that I want to emphasize in my overly simplistic characterization of business dynamics, of models of business dynamics, we shouldn't just think about the startups and the gazelles and that sort of process. All businesses are subject to a variety of kind of shocks, and so I've listed here in picture form globalization, IT, oil price shocks, for example, obviously economy-wide shocks and financial shocks. And all such businesses, and that's actually part of the creative destruction process. Just because you were a gazelle 20 years ago doesn't mean you got the formula for success today. The question is, can you adapt to the changing economic conditions? Is that a bad thing, that just past success doesn't mean current success? No, that's actually, again, very much part of the healthy market dynamics that we want to talk about. But we also know, and again, this is a very simplistic characterization of business dynamics, that many things can go wrong. And lately, we've been especially interested in the role of financial markets. And as I've said, financial markets play a role, and I think this is important for policy purposes. Don't just think about the financing associated with the startup process. That's only part of the story. And indeed, can I say markets may be working out fine still for startups, but what's critical is, if you're a potential gazelle, is there financing available? Are those markets working well? And I think lots of us are concerned that financial crisis has caused problems for the financing both of startups, but also for fast-growing young businesses. And so I'm going to end my remarks by asking, is there any evidence that this is what's going on? And the evidence I'm going to present is only very suggestive, but I think kind of provocative about what's been going on in the startup process in the United States. So can I say the good news is this is my last slide. So what am I showing here? I'm showing you two very basic statistics. And the more interesting statistic is the blue bar. So let me talk about the less interesting statistic, just so the red bar is just the average size of a new business firm in the United States. And you can see, this is related to something we said before, it's small. It's measured on the right axis. It's small. Okay, it's about 6 workers. Okay, and it has some fluctuations, but it's been pretty steady. Whereas the blue bar is the firm startup rate. All right, and so by the way, the combination of this, the startup rate plus the number of workers created by each new firm, is the job creation from startups. So these are the two ingredients. So I've just sort of decomposed that job creation in terms of the startup rate itself and then the average for each of them. And so I want to focus initially. I'm sure everybody's thinking, I see all kinds of things in the blue bar. I'm going to start with the recession. So it's pretty striking that the startup rate has fallen dramatically in the United States since 2006. All right. Now, is this evidence that it was, by the way, it was financing problems that caused this? No, by the way, I am working on that, but I don't want to, and I'm happy to talk about what we know and don't know about this process if we want to talk about those questions. But I think it is pretty striking that the job creation rate from, and I've also got that evidence, but I'm not going to give you yet another slide, I promise. The job creation rate overall in the United States economy has slowed dramatically in the recession. And I've shown you evidence that it's startups and fast-growing young businesses that account for a large fraction of such job creation. And if you cut the start-off rate off, if that falls dramatically, that one is obviously the startup rate itself is down, but by construction there's going to be fewer young businesses. Okay, you can't invent young businesses unless you have startups. All right, so we've obviously seen, and I have evidence of this, the fraction of activity accounted for by young businesses has fallen dramatically in this recession. And so now I'm sure you guys have seen other things in looking at this figure. I think there's not only a big cyclical decline, but there's also a huge secular decline in the startup rate. And so for those who were kind of took the view, and indeed you could, if you listen to the earlier parts of my lecture, I've been very much advocating the critical role that startups and young businesses play for both job and productivity growth. And the characterization I've given is they are critical for the U.S. reinventing itself, for developing new products and new processes. They are the part of the economy where there's lots of experimentation that goes on. And it's where, can I say, we bring out some of these examples which are my gazelles. There's where the Googles come from. Okay? And if, in many ways, if you look at the blue bar, you have to say that the U.S. is doing less of that experimentation now than it used to be. So over this graph goes from 1980 to the present, and what year has the lowest pace of startups over the entire last 30 years? 2010. Okay, and it's dramatically down from the 80s and the 1990s. What's that due to? Partly due to cyclical factors, as we've just been discussing. But there's also something else going on, and I'm working heavily on that, but I probably want to bring my remarks to a close. I said this was my last slide, but my last chart. I'm going to give some final remarks. But this is raising questions in the U.S. about, is part of the reason the U.S. is struggling in its recovery is it doesn't quite have this entrepreneurial dynamic that it used to have in earlier recoveries. So truly last slide. Hopefully it's clear what my messages are. A key part of my message was to provide guidance about the conventional wisdom of the role of small businesses in job creation. What we find in the evidence is it's age, not size, that's critical. It's startups and fast-growing young and small businesses that are creating lots of jobs, not so much small per se. But in some ways I want to avoid exchanging one bad soundbite for another bad soundbite. Okay, so I don't want you to go away saying, oh, it's all about startups and young businesses. Indeed, I hope my remarks have said you need to think about where they fit into this creative destruction process. They are part of economies reinventing themselves. And so yes, they play a critical role, but we need to think about that in terms of, yes, this is a way that modern economies reinvent themselves, is through entry and exit, through creation and destruction. And again, when things are going well, that's paid off in terms of both jobs and productivity. But it's also the case that once you recognize it's startups and young businesses, it makes you think. You remember that little sort of silly little picture book version of firm dynamics. It makes you think about all the challenges and barriers that startups and young businesses face. All right, and so you can easily imagine where things start breaking down. Can I say, especially in a financial crisis, but where they might break down in lots of countries. So now let me kind of finish on those remarks. I think an interesting thing to look for many countries is what's going on with your startup rate. Do you actually have a healthy pace of startups? But again, it'd be a mistake to only look at that. Okay. What I think you ought to especially be looking at is, do I see the kind of up or out dynamic that I described here? Is it the case that the productive, profitable, high demand, high productivity, low cost young businesses, do they take off? And can I say there is evidence that the US has historically been especially good in its post-entry performance. And there's also evidence that as you look around the world, if you look, let's not think about U.S. versus Europe, where obviously Europe's struggling right now, but let's look at the countries really struggling, the emerging economies. Do they have a shortage of entrepreneurship in emerging economies? No, actually, you could say there's too many entrepreneurs. There's an enormous number of these mice. The problem is none of them grow. Okay, none of them take off. All right, and so that's kind of the challenge: is do you have an environment that's going to allow for the gazelles to take off? And when things are going well, historically in the United States, that's been critical. You could say in Europe we should ask the question, you know, are there gazelles, and what are the barriers for them taking off? As we go around the world, we know for a fact that indeed that is kind of the problem. It's not a shortage of entrepreneurship per se. There's lots of people running their own business, but they're basically, you know, carts in the street, and they're not going to be the source of the kind of job creation that I talked about today. So I'll stop there, and thanks very much.
Grazie professore, abbiamo imparato moltissime cose dalla sua esposizione. Un paio di questioni da...
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much. There are a couple of questions that come to my mind, and then we'll throw the floor open for discussion. The first thing I'd like to ask is as follows. We understand that as young startups, so that create more jobs. In your analysis, especially on the US market, could you ever imagine what would happen if, with the recession, we wouldn't have any startups? Do you have a plan B, as it were? You just showed us a chart on the decline in the number of startups created in the US. So this is the first question. Then two more questions related to Europe. Then first. So given the fact that we are at a time of crisis in the Eurozone, how can we push, how can we encourage, promote the development of startups, of young startups? Do you think we should opt for tax allowances and the cutting down of red tape? Do you think this is a way forward? Now, with an eye to Italy then, this morning we talked about the private industry in Italy. We have also a prevalent role being played by civil servants, so with over 3.5 million civil servants in the country. Do you think that we have to size down the public sector altogether in Italy and in Europe as well? Then my very last question again on Europe. important decisions are to be taken in Europe, hopefully. Such important decisions should be taken at the European Council at the end of June, encouraging the adoption of a number of initiatives to see the recovery of the Eurozone after the very hard line that has been adopted so far. There are a number of ideas now at stake. One is very much supported by the Italian government, and I'd like to hear what you think about it. Do you think, for example, that the can lead to the potential creation of new jobs? Do you think that the idea that has been put forward by the Italian government, that is supported by the Italian government, that of the golden rule, whereby we would have a different evaluation of expenditures for investment. In the US, you don't have the Stability Pact. We do have it in Europe, and we have very tight budget constraints. That could ease up new resources for development. These are the questions that